Imagine holding in your hands the most valuable secret of World War II, a secret that could save millions of lives or condemn them to death. Hans-Thilo Schmidt, a bitter German clerk overlooked for promotion, stood in a Berlin office in 1930, one with exactly that power. The Enigma machine's operating manuals lay before him, and across the desk sat a French intelligence officer with a briefcase full of cash. One decision, one moment, one betrayal that would change the course of human history. This is the story of the man who stole the key to Hitler's secrets, the brilliant mathematicians who turned that key into victory, and the terrible price paid by everyone involved. What you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about World War II's greatest intelligence triumph. Welcome to Frontline Wars. The rain hammered against the windows of the Grand Hotel in Verviers, Belgium, near the German border. It was November 1931, and inside room 127, two men sat across from each other at a small wooden table. The tension between them could have been cut with a knife. One was Hans-Thilo Schmidt, a 43-year-old German civilian employee of the Reichswehr's cipher office. The other was Rodolphe Lemon, a French intelligence agent operating under the code name Rex. Between them lay documents that would alter the trajectory of the coming war, documents that detailed the inner workings of Germany's new encryption device, the Enigma machine. Schmidt's hands trembled slightly as he pushed the papers across the table. Not from fear, though that would have been justified. Any German caught selling military secrets faced certain execution. No, Schmidt's hands shook with something else entirely. A toxic mixture of resentment, greed, and a burning desire for revenge against a system that had, in his mind, denied him his rightful place. To understand how this moment came to be, we need to step back to the end of the First World War. Hans-Thilo Schmidt had served as a lieutenant in the German army, and like millions of his countrymen, he emerged from that catastrophic conflict into a Germany that was economically devastated, politically chaotic, and psychologically shattered. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed crushing reparations on Germany. Hyperinflation had destroyed the savings of the middle class, and the proud Prussian military tradition lay in ruins. For Schmidt, the personal humiliation was particularly acute. His older brother, Rudolf Schmidt, had risen through the ranks to become a general in the new Reichswehr, the limited military force Germany was permitted under the treaty. Rudolf was everything Hans-Thilo was not: successful, decorated, respected. He embodied the Prussian military virtues of discipline, honor, and dedication to the fatherland. Hans-Thilo, by contrast, had left the military after the war and struggled to find his footing in civilian life. His soap manufacturing business failed. His pride was wounded. His bank account was empty. In 1930, desperate for income and status, Schmidt used his brother's influence to secure a position at the cipher office of the Reichswehr in Berlin. It was clerical work, bureaucratic and unglamorous, but it came with access to some of Germany's most closely guarded secrets. The cipher office was responsible for military communications security, and at the heart of their operations was a remarkable new machine that German military planners believed would render their communications absolutely unbreakable: the Enigma. The Enigma machine was an engineering marvel of its time. Originally invented in the early 1920s as a commercial device for protecting business secrets, it had been adapted by the German military into what they considered an invincible encryption system. The machine looked like a complex typewriter housed in a wooden box. When an operator pressed a letter key, electrical current would flow through a series of rotating wheels called rotors, each wired in a unique pattern. The current would then pass through a reflector and back through the rotors via a different path, finally illuminating a letter on a lampboard. The illuminated letter was the encrypted version of the original letter. What made Enigma so powerful was its astronomical number of possible settings. The machine used 3 rotors chosen from a set of 5, and each rotor could be set to any of 26 starting positions. Additionally, the rotors could be arranged in any order, and a plugboard at the front of the machine allowed pairs of letters to be swapped before the encryption process even began. When you multiplied all these variables together, the number of possible Enigma configurations exceeded 100 million. German cryptographers believed that even if an enemy captured an Enigma machine without knowing the daily settings, which changed every 24 hours, Breaking the code would require centuries of mathematical calculation. They were wrong, but they wouldn't discover their error until it was far too late. Schmidt's work at the cipher office gave him access to the operational manuals for the Enigma machine, documents that explained not only how the device functioned, but also the procedures for its daily use, including how settings were distributed to operators across the military. These documents were classified as top secret, and their theft would constitute one of the highest acts of treason imaginable. But by the autumn of 1931, Hans-Thilo Schmidt had decided that his resentment toward the German system outweighed his loyalty to it. He would sell these secrets to the highest bidder, and he would use the money to live the life of comfort and status he felt he deserved. Schmidt's opportunity came through a chance encounter at a social gathering. He met a man who introduced himself as a businessman, but who was actually Rodolphe Lemon, a veteran intelligence agent working for the French Deuxième Bureau, France's military intelligence service. Lemon was a master recruiter, skilled at identifying potential sources and understanding what motivated them. In Schmidt, he recognized immediately the telltale signs of a man ripe for recruitment: bitterness about his station in life, financial pressure, and an inflated sense of his own importance. Lemon began cultivating Schmidt carefully, suggesting that a man of his knowledge and position might be able to provide certain information that would be, shall we say, generously compensated. And so they arrived at that rainy evening in Verviers, where Schmidt handed over photographs and documents related to the Enigma machine in exchange for what would be the first of many payments from French intelligence. The French gave Schmidt a code name, Haché, derived from the initials HE, which stood for Hans-Thilo's original last name, Schmidt. For the next decade, Haché would be one of the most valuable intelligence assets the Allies possessed, regularly providing updates on German cryptographic procedures, though he would remain unknown to the vast majority of those who would benefit from his treachery. But here's where the story becomes even more remarkable. Having the Enigma documents was one thing. Actually breaking the code was quite another. The French Deuxième Bureau's own cryptanalysts studied the Enigma materials provided by Schmidt and concluded that the system was, for all practical purposes, unbreakable. The mathematical complexity was simply too great, even with knowledge of the machine's inner workings. Without knowing the specific daily settings, which rotors were in use, their starting positions, and the plugboard connections, intercepted German messages would remain gibberish. The French might have given up at that point, but they had allies who thought differently. In 1932, the French shared the Enigma intelligence with their Polish counterparts. Poland, situated between Germany and the Soviet Union, had perhaps the strongest motivation of any European nation to break German codes. The Poles understood that their survival might well depend on knowing German military intentions before they became German military actions. And so the task of cracking Enigma fell to a group of brilliant young Polish mathematicians working for the Cipher Bureau in Warsaw. Men who would approach the problem with fresh eyes and revolutionary methods. Chief among these mathematicians was a 27-year-old named Marian Rejewski. While the French cryptanalysts had approached Enigma as a linguistic puzzle, trying to use traditional code-breaking techniques based on letter frequency and pattern analysis, Rejewski recognized that Enigma was fundamentally a mathematical problem. The rotors created permutations, the plugboard created substitutions, and the whole system could be understood through the lens of group theory, a branch of abstract mathematics that deals with symmetry and transformation. Working with the documents provided by Schmidt, along with actual commercial Enigma machines that the Poles had purchased, Rejewski set about building a mathematical model of how the military Enigma worked. This was painstaking work that required not only mathematical brilliance, but also incredible persistence. Rejewski and his colleagues, Jerzy Rosiecki and Henryk Zygalski, worked for months on the problem, developing new mathematical techniques and building mechanical devices to speed up the testing of possible settings. Then came the breakthrough. In December 1932, using pure mathematical deduction combined with a stroke of insight about how German operators were likely choosing their message keys, Rejewski succeeded in determining the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors. This was an astonishing achievement. He had essentially reverse-engineered one of the most complex encryption devices in existence using nothing but mathematics and intercepted encrypted messages. With the rotor wiring known, the Poles could now build replica Enigma machines, and more importantly, they could begin the work of actually reading German military communications. But reading individual messages still required determining the daily settings, and this remained a monumental task. The Poles developed increasingly sophisticated techniques to narrow down the possibilities. They created catalogs of patterns that would appear when certain rotor positions were used. They built electromechanical machines called bommy, the ancestors of the later British bombs, that could rapidly test thousands of possible settings. By the mid-1930s, the Polish Cipher Bureau was regularly reading German Enigma traffic, providing their government with invaluable intelligence about German military planning and diplomatic maneuvering. Throughout this period, Hans-Thilo Schmidt continued to provide updated information to the French, who passed it along to the Poles. Schmidt was motivated purely by money. The French paid him generously, and he used these funds to maintain a lifestyle well beyond what his official salary would support. He had a mistress in Paris, frequented expensive restaurants, and lived as though he were the important man he believed himself to be. His brother Rudolf, meanwhile, continued rising through the ranks of the German military, eventually commanding panzer divisions on the Eastern Front, completely unaware that his younger brother was betraying everything their family stood for. As the 1930s progressed and Hitler consolidated power in Germany, the stakes of the cryptographic war grew ever higher. The German military expanded the Enigma system, increasing its complexity and changing procedures to make code-breaking more difficult. In 1938, they added 2 more rotors to choose from, bringing the total to 5, which dramatically increased the number of possible configurations. For the Poles, this meant their existing methods and machines were no longer sufficient. They would need more resources, more machines, more mathematicians, resources that Poland, watching Germany's aggressive expansion with growing alarm, could ill afford to spare. The Poles made a fateful decision. In July 1939, with war clearly imminent, they invited French and British intelligence representatives to Warsaw and shared everything they had learned about breaking Enigma. They provided replica Enigma machines, explained their mathematical methods, and gave detailed instructions on how to build the bommy machines. This was an extraordinary act of intelligence cooperation, and it would prove crucial to the Allied war effort. The British representatives could scarcely believe what they were hearing. The Poles had achieved what British cryptanalysts, working independently, had considered impossible. Just weeks after this meeting, on September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland, and the Second World War began. The Polish Cipher Bureau evacuated as the German advance overwhelmed Polish defenses. Rejewski, Rozycki, and Zygalski managed to escape to France with their precious knowledge, eventually making their way to Britain. Many of their colleagues were not so fortunate, disappearing into the chaos of war or falling into German hands. The intelligence work, however, continued with new urgency. In Britain, the government code and cipher school had been relocated to a Victorian mansion called Bletchley Park, about 50 miles north of London. It was here that the code-breaking effort would be concentrated, drawing together some of the finest mathematical and linguistic minds in Britain, along with the Polish expertise that had been shared just before the war began. Bletchley Park would become the nerve center of Allied signals intelligence, employing at its peak over 9,000 people, most of them young women who performed the painstaking work of operating the code-breaking machines and analyzing the decrypted messages. The most famous figure associated with Bletchley Park was Alan Turing, a mathematical genius who would make fundamental contributions to both the war effort and the development of modern computing. Turing arrived at Bletchley Park in September 1939, just as the war was beginning, and immediately set to work on the Enigma problem. Building on the Polish foundations, Turing designed a more sophisticated electromechanical machine called the bomb that could test rotor settings far more rapidly than the Polish bommy. The British bombs were massive contraptions, standing over 6 feet tall and weighing more than a ton, filled with rotating drums that simulated the action of multiple Enigma machines simultaneously. The principle behind the bomb was elegant in its logic. The codebreakers would look for cribs, probable words or phrases that they suspected appeared in a particular encrypted message. German military communications were often formulaic, following set patterns that made such guesses possible. For example, weather reports frequently contained the German word, Wetter, followed by specific format phrases. Once a crib was identified and its position in the message estimated, the bomb could be set up to test which rotor settings would produce that plaintext from the intercepted ciphertext. When the machine found a match, it would stop, and the operators would know they had likely found the correct daily settings. But even with the bombs, breaking Enigma remained a daily race against time. The German military changed their Enigma settings every 24 hours at midnight. This meant that every day, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had to start from scratch, analyzing intercepted messages and running the bombs until they found settings that worked. Sometimes they would break the code within a few hours. Other times, particularly when the Germans were being especially careful about communications security, it might take most of the day, or they might not break it at all. Every hour that passed without breaking the code was an hour during which critical intelligence about German military operations remained locked away. The intelligence gleaned from decrypted Enigma messages was given the code name Ultra, and it was protected with extraordinary security measures. The very existence of Ultra was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. Only a tiny number of senior military and political leaders were privy to Ultra intelligence, and even they were often given the information without being told its source. The fear was that if the Germans suspected their Enigma communications were being read, they would change their entire cryptographic system, and years of mathematical work would be rendered useless overnight. This security imperative created agonizing ethical dilemmas. There were instances where British intelligence learned through Ultra of impending German attacks, but commanders had to limit their response to avoid revealing that they had advanced knowledge. Ships were allowed to sail into danger, cities were left vulnerable to bombing raids, and individual military operations were sometimes sacrificed, all to protect the secret that Enigma had been broken. The most famous alleged example involves the German bombing of Coventry in November 1940. Some historians have claimed that Churchill knew about the raid through Ultra, but allowed it to proceed to protect the secret of Enigma. While the historical record on this specific incident is disputed, the broader dilemma was very real. How many lives could be sacrificed in the short term to protect an intelligence source that might save far more lives in the long run? The impact of ultra-intelligence on the war's conduct was profound and multifaceted. In the Battle of the Atlantic, where German U-boats sought to strangle Britain by sinking merchant ships carrying vital supplies, ultra-intelligence about U-boat positions and tactics proved crucial. Convoy routes could be adjusted to avoid known U-boat concentrations. Anti-submarine forces could be directed to areas where U-boats were operating. When the Germans introduced new procedures or tactics, Bletchley Park would often detect these changes in the Enigma traffic before they could be fully implemented. The battle was still desperately close. Thousands of Allied sailors died in the freezing Atlantic waters. But without Ultra, Britain might well have been starved into submission. In North Africa, Ultra-intelligence gave British commanders insights into German supply situations, planned offensives, and even the personal communications of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. General Bernard Montgomery, commanding British forces in North Africa, once remarked that Ultra was worth an entire armored division to him. When Rommel's supply convoys were at sea, their routes and schedules were often known to the British through decrypted Enigma messages, allowing the Royal Navy and RAF to intercept them with devastating effectiveness. Rommel's Africa Corps, consistently short of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements, was fighting not just against Montgomery's 8th Army, but against an invisible enemy that could read Rommel's every communication with Berlin. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 benefited enormously from ultra-intelligence. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, that much was obvious, but they didn't know where or exactly when. Through Enigma decrypts, the Allies could monitor German defensive preparations, track the movement of panzer divisions, and most critically, assess whether their elaborate deception plan, Operation Fortitude, was succeeding. Fortitude was designed to convince the Germans that the main invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, rather than Normandy. Decrypted German messages confirmed that Hitler and his high command believed the deception, keeping powerful German forces away from Normandy even after the invasion began. In the critical days following D-Day, when the Allied beachhead was most vulnerable, ultra-intelligence helped Allied commanders anticipate German counterattacks and allocate forces accordingly. On the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union bore the brunt of fighting against Nazi Germany, the intelligence picture was more complicated. Churchill was deeply suspicious of Stalin and reluctant to share ultra-intelligence directly with the Soviets for fear that the secret would leak. However, the British did pass along strategic intelligence to Moscow, carefully disguised to hide its source. The Soviets also conducted their own signals intelligence operations and achieved some success against German codes, though the extent of their cryptographic achievements remains partially obscured by Cold War secrecy. Throughout all of this, Hans-Thilo Schmidt continued his double life in Berlin. He maintained his position at the cipher office, though as the war progressed he was transferred to other departments. He continued meeting with French intelligence handlers when he could, passing along whatever information came his way. The payments from the French had made him a wealthy man by his own standards, and he seemed to feel little guilt about his betrayal. In his mind, he was simply taking what was owed to him by a system that had failed to recognize his worth. But Schmidt's luck was running out. The German counterintelligence services, particularly the Abwehr and later the SS Security Service, were skilled and thorough. They knew that secrets were leaking, even if they didn't know the full extent or the source. Throughout the war, German military leaders occasionally expressed concerns about communications security. There were instances where they suspected the Allies might have access to Enigma traffic. But these suspicions were never definitively confirmed, and the German High Command ultimately convinced themselves that Enigma remained secure. They made this judgment partly through arrogance. The mathematical complexity of Enigma seemed to make it unbreakable, and partly through a failure of imagination. They couldn't conceive that the Poles, and later the British, had assembled the industrial-scale mathematical operation necessary to break the code on a daily basis. In 1943, the net began to close around Schmidt. A combination of routine counterintelligence work and information extracted from captured French resistance members led German investigators to identify Aché. When they traced the codename back to Hans-Thilo Schmidt, the revelation must have been devastating for his brother Rudolf, now a general commanding troops on the Eastern Front. The Gestapo arrested Hans-Thilo in Berlin, and he was subjected to intensive interrogation. Initially, he denied everything, but faced with evidence and the certainty of execution for treason, he eventually confessed to selling Enigma secrets to the French. What Schmidt told his interrogators in those final days remains partially obscured by the chaos of war's end and the destruction of records. The Gestapo was notoriously brutal in its interrogation methods, and Schmidt may have revealed much or little about the full extent of his espionage. Crucially, the Germans still did not understand the full scope of what had been accomplished with the information Schmidt had provided. They knew he had betrayed Enigma secrets, but they appear not to have grasped that these secrets had been the foundation for breaking Enigma on an industrial scale. The German High Command instituted some additional security measures, but they did not abandon Enigma or even dramatically overhaul their procedures. This was a catastrophic intelligence failure that would haunt German military operations for the remainder of the war. On September 19, 1943, Hans-Thilo Schmidt was found dead in his cell at the Gestapo prison. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, though like many suicides in Gestapo custody, the truth may have been more complex. Whether he took his own life to escape further torture and the certainty of execution, or whether he was killed by his captors, Schmidt's story ended in a Berlin prison cell, far from the comfortable life he had imagined his espionage would buy him. His brother Rudolf survived the war, was captured by the Soviets, and spent years in Soviet prison camps before being released in the 1950s. Rudolf lived until 1957, carrying the knowledge of his brother's betrayal and the shame it brought to the Schmidt family name. In his later years, Rudolf maintained that he had known nothing of Hans-Thilo's espionage, and there is no evidence to contradict this claim. The bitter irony was that, while Rudolf served with distinction in the Wehrmacht, his younger brother's actions may have contributed more to the war's outcome than any number of military victories Rudolf achieved on the battlefield. The full story of Enigma's breaking remained secret long after the war ended. When the fighting stopped in May 1945, the British government made a fateful decision. They would not reveal that Enigma had been broken. Instead, they gathered up captured Enigma machines and sold or gave them to countries around the world, suggesting they were secure encryption devices. Several nations, including some in Africa and the Middle East, adopted Enigma for their own military and diplomatic communications, completely unaware that Britain could read every message. This deception continued into the 1970s, providing British intelligence with a steady stream of decrypted diplomatic and military traffic for decades after the war. The secrecy around Bletchley Park and Ultra was so complete that even those who had worked there were sworn to silence. Thousands of people who had spent years performing vital war work could not tell their families, could not put their wartime service on their resumes, could not speak about the most significant period of their lives. Many took their secrets to the grave, their contributions to victory unknown and unrecognized. It wasn't until 1974, nearly 30 years after the war's end, that the British government began to release information about Ultra, and only then because some of the story was starting to leak out through other sources. Marian Rejewski, the brilliant Polish mathematician who had first broken Enigma, returned to Poland after the war and lived quietly, working as an accountant and later at an agricultural equipment factory. He could not speak publicly about his wartime achievements, while Poland remained under Soviet domination. The communist authorities were uninterested in celebrating a victory achieved in cooperation with the Western Allies. Only in the late 1970s, after the British revelations about Ultra, could Rejewski finally tell his story. He gave several interviews and wrote memoirs before his death in 1980, ensuring that the Polish contribution to breaking Enigma was finally recognized. Alan Turing's post-war fate was tragic in a different way. Despite his enormous contributions to the war effort and to the foundations of computer science, Turing was prosecuted in 1952 for homosexuality, which was then illegal in Britain. He was convicted and subjected to chemical castration as an alternative to prison. 2 years later, at the age of 41, Turing died from cyanide poisoning in what was ruled a suicide, though some have suggested it may have been accidental. It wasn't until 2009 that the British government issued an official apology for Turing's treatment, and in 2013, Queen Elizabeth II granted him a posthumous pardon. Today, Turing is recognized as one of the most important figures of the 20th century, but he died believing himself disgraced and destroyed by the same government he had served so brilliantly. The women of Bletchley Park, who made up the majority of the workforce and performed the grinding daily labor of operating the bombs and analyzing the decrypted messages, were similarly silenced for decades. Their stories have only recently begun to be fully told, as historians have worked to recover the contributions of these thousands of women who were sworn to secrecy, and whose work was dismissed after the war as merely clerical. In fact, their work was anything but clerical. They operated complex machines, made crucial analytical judgments, and maintained the relentless 24-hour-a-day operation that kept the intelligence flowing to military commanders. Without their contributions, the mathematical brilliance of Turing and Rejewski would have remained merely theoretical. The ultimate question that historians have grappled with is this: how much did breaking Enigma actually matter to the war's outcome? The consensus view is that while ultra-intelligence did not win the war by itself, wars are won by soldiers, sailors, and airmen, not by intelligence analysts. It unquestionably shortened the war and saved countless lives. Some estimates suggest that breaking Enigma shortened the war in Europe by as much as 2 years. If that estimate is even approximately correct, the implications are staggering. 2 more years of war would have meant millions more dead in combat, millions more killed in the Holocaust, and potentially the use of atomic weapons against Germany rather than Japan. In the Battle of the Atlantic alone, ultra-intelligence is credited with reducing merchant shipping losses significantly. Given that Britain was dependent on imports for survival and came perilously close to being starved into submission, this contribution was potentially war-winning. In North Africa, the Mediterranean, and later in France and Germany, ultra-intelligence gave Allied commanders an advantage that German commanders, despite their tactical skill and operational excellence, could rarely overcome. It was like playing chess against an opponent who could see your pieces, but whose own pieces were invisible to you. Not an insurmountable advantage, but a profound one that affected nearly every decision and operation. There's a broader lesson here about the nature of modern warfare and intelligence. The Second World War was the first major conflict where signals intelligence, the interception and decryption of enemy communications, played a decisive strategic role. Previous wars had certainly involved espionage and code breaking, But never on this scale, never with this level of sophistication, and never with this degree of impact on military operations. The Enigma story helped establish the template for how nations would think about communications security and signals intelligence for the rest of the 20th century and into our own time. The Cold War saw an enormous expansion of signals intelligence capabilities by both Western and Soviet blocs, building directly on the lessons and technologies developed during the war. The National Security Agency in the United States and the Government Communications Headquarters in Britain, both direct descendants of wartime intelligence organizations, became massive bureaucracies dedicated to intercepting and analyzing electronic communications worldwide. The eternal cat-and-mouse game between codemakers and codebreakers that played out with Enigma continued with increasingly sophisticated computer-based encryption systems. In our digital age, the fundamental tension remains the same. Governments and militaries require secure communications to operate effectively, while intelligence services work constantly to penetrate those communications. The mathematics has become vastly more complex. Modern encryption systems rely on computational problems that are believed to be impossible even for the most powerful computers to solve. But the principle remains identical to what the Polish mathematicians discovered in the 1930s. Any cipher can be broken given sufficient mathematical insight, computing power, and perseverance. The Enigma story also raises uncomfortable questions about secrecy, loyalty, and betrayal that remain relevant today. Hans-Thilo Schmidt was by any standard a traitor who sold his country's secrets for money. He was motivated not by ideology or moral conviction, but by greed and personal resentment. Yet his betrayal contributed to defeating one of history's most evil regimes and potentially saved millions of lives. Does this make his actions heroic or simply accidentally beneficial? The question is not easily answered. Similarly, the Polish and British codebreakers who broke Enigma were on the right side of history, working to defeat Nazi Germany. But the techniques and capabilities they developed were later used by their governments in ways that were ethically far more ambiguous, intercepting the communications of neutral nations, spying on allies, and conducting surveillance that raised serious civil liberties concerns. The same mathematical methods that helped win a just war became tools of peacetime intelligence, gathering that many would question. The decision to keep Enigmas breaking secret after the war and to actively deceive other nations into using compromised Enigma machines is another moral gray area. From an intelligence perspective, the decision made perfect sense. Why give up a valuable source of information? But it meant that British intelligence was reading the supposedly secure communications of nations that believed themselves to be communicating in confidence, some of them newly independent former colonies. The intelligence advantage was significant, but the ethics of such deception are debatable. What's beyond debate is the extraordinary achievement that breaking Enigma represented. A group of mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and dedicated workers, most of them young and many of them women, took on a problem that experts had declared impossible and solved it. They did so through a combination of mathematical brilliance, technological innovation, painstaking analytical work, and sheer determination. They worked long hours under enormous pressure, knowing that lives depended on their success, but unable to see the direct results of their efforts. They maintained their secrets for decades, even when doing so meant their contributions went unrecognized and unrewarded. The physical artifacts of this achievement have largely disappeared. Bletchley Park itself was nearly demolished in the post-war years and has only recently been restored as a museum. Most of the bombs were destroyed after the war. The British government wanted no evidence of their cryptographic capabilities to survive. The Enigma machines themselves are now collector's items, found in museums and private collections, silent witnesses to a war of mathematics and secrecy that raged alongside the more visible war of tanks and bombers. But the intellectual legacy of the Enigma codebreakers is profound and continues to shape our world. Alan Turing's work at Bletchley Park contributed directly to his theories of computation that became the foundation of modern computer science. The idea of a Turing machine, an abstract mathematical model of computation, grew out of his thinking about how to mechanize the process of testing cryptographic keys. The concept of the stored program computer, where instructions and data are both held in memory and manipulated by a central processor, owes much to the wartime work on specialized calculating machines for cryptographic purposes. The institutional legacy is equally significant. The cryptographic organizations that emerged from the war, NSA in America, GCHQ in Britain, became permanent fixtures of their governments, employing thousands of mathematicians, computer scientists, linguists, and engineers. They pushed the boundaries of computing technology, often decades ahead of commercial developments, because they needed ever greater computational power to break ever more complex codes. Much of the early development of computer science, from hardware architecture to programming languages to networking protocols, was driven by the needs of signals intelligence agencies trying to intercept and decrypt electronic communications. The Enigma story also shaped how we think about the relationship between mathematics and national security. Before the war, pure mathematics was often seen as an abstract discipline with little practical application. The cryptographic successes of the war demonstrated conclusively that advanced mathematics could have immediate and decisive real-world impact. In the post-war period, governments invested heavily in mathematical research, funding university departments and establishing research institutes, often with national security applications in mind. This investment helped produce the mathematical foundations of the digital age we now inhabit. There's a human dimension to the Enigma story that we shouldn't overlook. These were real people facing real challenges, often under conditions of great stress and uncertainty. The young mathematicians at Bletchley Park were working on problems at the absolute cutting edge of human knowledge, under time pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. Many of them were barely out of university, suddenly thrust into positions of enormous responsibility. The young women operating the bombs worked brutal shifts, 8 hours on, 8 hours off, around the clock, performing work that was mentally exhausting and sometimes physically dangerous. The machines could malfunction spectacularly, and there were injuries from the rotating drums and electrical systems. They dealt with the normal challenges of young adults, relationships, family problems, career uncertainties, while also carrying the burden of absolute secrecy. They couldn't tell their families what they were doing, couldn't explain why their work was important, couldn't share their frustrations or celebrate their successes, except with their colleagues who were bound by the same oath of secrecy. They watched the war unfold in newspapers and on newsreels, sometimes knowing through their work that battles were coming or operations were planned, but unable to say anything to anyone outside their closed world. The stress of maintaining this secrecy for years took its toll. There are accounts of breakdowns, of people cracking under the psychological pressure of holding such vital secrets while appearing to the outside world to be doing ordinary clerical work. There were also romances, friendships, and human connections formed under these extraordinary circumstances, bonds that had to be maintained in silence after the war ended, without any public acknowledgement of the shared experience that had forged them. For Hans-Thilo Schmidt, the human dimension was darker. He chose betrayal, motivated by the worst of human impulses, greed, resentment, and wounded pride. He lived a double life for over a decade, meeting clandestinely with foreign agents, lying to colleagues and family, all while maintaining the facade of a loyal German civil servant. The money he received bought him comfort and status, but it's hard to imagine he could have felt much peace. He must have known that discovery would mean death, must have understood that he was committing an act that would stain his family's honor forever. When the end came, whether by his own hand or another's, it came in a prison cell, his brother's career tarnished, his name synonymous with traitor. Yet without Schmidt's initial betrayal, the entire chain of events that led to breaking Enigma might never have been set in motion. The Polish mathematicians might not have had the crucial initial information they needed. The British might not have received the benefit of Polish expertise before Poland fell. The course of the war might have been very different. It's a troubling thought that such an important outcome might have depended on the venality of one bitter man. This contingency, the role of chance and individual decisions in shaping historical outcomes, is a recurring theme in the Enigma story. What if Schmidt had not become so resentful? What if the French had not shared the Enigma documents with the Poles? What if the Poles had not developed their mathematical approach, or had failed to share their work with the British before Poland fell? What if Alan Turing had not been recruited to Bletchley Park? Or if the brilliant young women who operated the bombs had not been willing to perform such demanding work for modest pay and no public recognition? Any of these counterfactuals could have changed the outcome, potentially extending the war by months or years, with catastrophic consequences. This contingency reminds us that history is not predetermined, that individual choices and actions matter, and that outcomes we take for granted could easily have been different. The Allied victory in World War II was built on countless individual acts of courage, skill, sacrifice, and yes, in Schmidt's case, betrayal. Each person involved in the Enigma story made choices, some heroic, some base, some simply doing their job to the best of their ability, and collectively these choices shaped the war's trajectory. The recognition that eventually came to the Enigma codebreakers, decades after the fact, was both gratifying and bittersweet. Gratifying because their contributions were finally acknowledged, the secrecy that had bound them for so long finally lifted. Bittersweet because it came too late for many of them. Alan Turing died disgraced, believing his war service had been forgotten and his post-war contributions dismissed. Many of the women of Bletchley Park lived their entire lives without public recognition, their families never fully understanding what they had accomplished. Marian Rejewski lived for decades in Poland under a communist regime that had no interest in celebrating his achievement, unable to receive the international acclaim he deserved until he was nearly 70 years old. When historians finally began to piece together the full Enigma story in the 1970s and 1980s, interviewing the surviving participants and examining the declassified documents, they discovered a tale of human ingenuity and determination that rivaled any military campaign for drama and significance. Books were written, documentaries were filmed, and eventually Hollywood came calling. The 2014 film, The Imitation Game, despite taking considerable dramatic license with historical facts, brought the Enigma story to millions who had never heard of Bletchley Park or Alan Turing. The film was criticized by historians for its inaccuracies and simplifications, but it succeeded in its primary goal, making the public aware of this hidden history. Today, Bletchley Park is preserved as a museum and heritage site, attracting hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. The restored mansion and huts where the codebreakers worked now house exhibits explaining the Enigma machine, the mathematics of codebreaking, and the daily life of Bletchley Park's workers. A working replica of a bomb is on display, its drums rotating and relays clicking just as they did during the war, solving simulated Enigma problems. Visitors can see original Enigma machines, read translations of decrypted messages, and begin to understand the scale of the achievement. The museum also tells the human stories, the young women who operated the bombs, the mathematicians who solved impossible problems, the support staff who kept the operation running, and yes, the spies and traitors like Hans-Thilo Schmidt whose actions set everything in motion. It's a complex story that resists simple narratives of heroism and villainy, because the reality is far more nuanced. The same mathematical knowledge that helped defeat Nazi Germany also became a tool of government surveillance. The institutional structures created for wartime codebreaking evolved into peacetime intelligence agencies with controversial powers. The triumph of Allied codebreakers was built in part on German betrayal and Soviet blood. Understanding the Enigma story requires grappling with this complexity. It's not enough to celebrate the mathematical brilliance of Turing and Rejewski, though that brilliance certainly deserves celebration. We must also understand the social and political context that made their work possible and necessary. We must recognize the contributions of thousands whose names we don't know, who performed essential work without recognition or reward. We must acknowledge the moral compromises and ethical dilemmas that accompanied even this most justified of intelligence operations. And we must consider how the legacy of Enigma shapes our contemporary debates about privacy, security, and surveillance. In our current era, when governments and corporations collect vast amounts of data about their citizens and customers, when encryption is used to protect everything from banking transactions to private messages, when the tension between security and privacy is a constant political debate, the Enigma story remains powerfully relevant. The mathematical principles that allowed Enigma to be broken are the same principles underlying modern encryption. The institutional structures created during the Enigma era still exist, vastly expanded and operating in the shadows of classified programs. The ethical questions about when it's justified to break codes and read private communications are still fiercely debated. The digital age has made cryptography ubiquitous in ways that would astonish the Enigma codebreakers. Every time you send an email, make a phone call, or conduct an online transaction, encryption protects your communication. The algorithms involved are far more sophisticated than Enigma. They rely on mathematical problems like integer factorization and discrete logarithms that are believed to require millions of years of computing time to solve. But the fundamental principle remains the same. Encryption converts readable information into gibberish that only the intended recipient can understand. And just as in the Enigma era, there are people and organizations trying to break these codes. Modern signals intelligence agencies have capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction to the Bletchley Park codebreakers. They can intercept communications worldwide, store massive amounts of encrypted data for future analysis, and employ supercomputers far more powerful than anything that existed until the late 20th century. The mathematics has become more complex, but the game remains essentially unchanged, an eternal contest between those who want to keep secrets and those who want to uncover them. The Enigma story also speaks to the power of interdisciplinary collaboration. Breaking Enigma required not just mathematicians, but also linguists who understood German military terminology, engineers who could build the bombs, intercept operators who could capture the signals, analysts who could interpret the decrypted messages, and administrators who could manage the entire operation. No single person or discipline could have accomplished it alone. This lesson, that complex problems require diverse teams with different expertise working together, is perhaps more relevant today than ever, as we face challenges from climate change to pandemic disease to artificial intelligence that require unprecedented cooperation across disciplines and nations. There's also a lesson about the importance of fundamental research. The Polish mathematicians who broke Enigma were drawing on advanced mathematics, group theory and permutation theory, that had been developed decades earlier by mathematicians working on purely abstract problems with no practical application in mind. Alan Turing's work on computability and his conceptual Turing machine were likewise abstract mathematical ideas. Yet when a practical problem arose, breaking Enigma, this abstract mathematics proved essential. This pattern has repeated throughout history. Pure research, conducted for its own sake with no immediate application, later turns out to be crucial for solving practical problems. It's an argument for supporting fundamental research, even when its utility isn't immediately obvious. The role of persistence and determination in the Enigma story cannot be overstated. Breaking Enigma wasn't a single moment of inspiration, but years of grinding work, solving one problem only to encounter another, pushing through failures and setbacks. Rejewski spent months working on the rotor wiring problem before his breakthrough. The bombs had to be operated constantly, day and night, testing thousands of settings before finding one that worked. The mathematicians and analysts at Bletchley Park dealt with constant pressure and frustration. Some days they could read Enigma traffic easily, other days the Germans would change procedures, and suddenly all that hard-won progress seemed worthless. But they persisted, they adapted, they solved each new problem as it arose. This persistence was particularly remarkable given that most of the people involved couldn't see the direct results of their work. The codebreakers didn't go to the front lines, didn't see the battles won or the ships saved because of their intelligence. They sat in huts at Bletchley Park, or in similar facilities elsewhere, staring at encrypted text and mathematical problems, often not knowing whether their work had made any difference at all. They had to trust that somewhere up the chain of command, someone was using their decrypts to make better decisions, to save lives, to win the war. That kind of dedication, working in secrecy toward an invisible goal, requires a special kind of commitment. The treatment of Alan Turing after the war stands as a particularly tragic failure. Here was a man who had contributed as much as anyone to the Allied victory, whose mathematical genius had helped save countless lives, who had laid the foundations for the computer age. And yet, because of laws criminalizing homosexuality and societal prejudices that seem barbaric today, he was persecuted, prosecuted, and driven to his death. It's impossible to know what additional contributions Turing might have made if he had lived a full life, what other problems he might have solved, what other insights he might have provided. His death was not only a personal tragedy, but a loss to science and to humanity. The eventual recognition and pardon that came to Turing decades after his death was important and necessary, but it couldn't undo the injustice he suffered. It stands as a reminder that being on the right side of one historical struggle, defeating Nazi Germany, doesn't automatically make a society just in all respects. Britain was fighting for freedom and democracy against totalitarian tyranny, but it was also a society that criminalized homosexuality, that denied women full equality, that maintained a vast colonial empire. The contradictions and complexities of history resist simple moral judgments. The Enigma story, in all its complexity, ultimately demonstrates something profound about human nature and human capability. When faced with an apparently impossible problem, a code that seemed unbreakable, a war that threatened civilization, human beings proved capable of extraordinary things. They developed new mathematics, built new machines, organized unprecedented collaborative efforts, and succeeded against enormous odds. They did this while maintaining absolute secrecy, often for years or decades, long after any practical need for that secrecy had passed. They sacrificed recognition, advancement, and in some cases their own well-being for a greater cause. But the story also demonstrates human weakness. Schmidt's betrayal grew from wounded pride and greed. The post-war treatment of Turing revealed the cruelty of prejudice. The decision to keep Enigma secret and use it for post-war intelligence gathering showed how easily justified wartime measures can become peacetime abuses. The failure to recognize the contributions of women and other marginalized groups at Bletchley Park reflected broader social injustices. The human beings who achieved great things were also capable of failures, both personal and systemic. In the end, the Enigma story defies simple categorization. It's a story of mathematical brilliance and human betrayal, of wartime heroism and post-war injustice, of triumph and tragedy intertwined. Hans-Thilo Schmidt, motivated by the basest instincts, set in motion events that helped defeat Hitler. Marian Rejewski, driven by patriotism and intellectual curiosity, solved a problem experts called impossible. Alan Turing, combining genius with determination, helped build the foundations of our digital age. Thousands of unnamed women operated the bombs and analyzed the decrypts that gave Allied commanders their advantage. All of these threads weave together into a tapestry that helped shape the 20th century and continues to influence our own time. The question of how we remember and understand the Enigma story matters because it shapes how we think about similar challenges today. Do we emphasize the individual genius of figures like Turing, or do we highlight the collective effort of thousands working together? Do we celebrate the mathematical triumph, or do we focus on the ethical complexities? Do we see it as a story of Allied virtue defeating Nazi evil, or as a more nuanced tale of human capabilities and limitations? The truth, as always, is that all of these perspectives have value, and the complete story requires holding multiple truths in tension. What remains clear, regardless of how we choose to emphasize different aspects of the story, is that breaking Enigma stands as one of the most significant intellectual achievements of the 20th century. It demonstrated that dedicated human effort, supported by mathematical insight and technological innovation, could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable. It showed that abstract mathematics could have immediate practical importance. It proved that collaborative, interdisciplinary teams could solve problems that individual genius alone could not. And it established patterns and precedents that continue to shape how nations think about security, intelligence, and cryptography. The men and women who broke Enigma, from the bitter traitor who provided the initial documents, to the brilliant mathematicians who developed the methods, to the thousands of workers who operated the machines and analyzed the results, collectively altered the course of history. They did so largely in silence, their contributions unknown and unrecognized for decades. When recognition finally came, it was incomplete and belated. Many died without ever receiving public acknowledgement of what they had accomplished. But their legacy endures in the world they helped shape. A world where computers are ubiquitous, where cryptography protects trillions of dollars in transactions daily, where the eternal contest between codemakers and codebreakers continues at scales and levels of sophistication the Enigma codebreakers could scarcely have imagined. The Enigma machine itself, once Germany's guarantee of unbreakable communications, now sits in museums as a testament to human ingenuity, both the ingenuity that created it and the greater ingenuity that broke it. Looking at an Enigma machine today, with its mechanical rotors and plugboard, it seems almost quaint, a relic of a vanished mechanical age. But in its day, it represented the cutting edge of encryption technology, and the effort required to break it pushed the boundaries of human knowledge and capability. The story of how it was broken, involving treachery and genius, persistence and sacrifice, remains one of the most compelling narratives of the Second World War. A hidden war fought with mathematics and determination, where the weapons were ideas and the battlefield was the human mind. And it reminds us that sometimes, the most important battles are the ones fought in silence, by people whose names we may never know, whose contributions remained secret for decades, but whose impact on history was profound and enduring.